Welcome to Chapter 3, where we will continue our exploration of the first chunk of the lifespan. And as we've already discovered, many aspects of it, especially those first 2 years of life, are very unique compared to any of the development that comes after it. So here we're talking about concluding from birth to 3 years. This is a very non-specific time range. We could talk about 2 years, we could talk about 3 years, basically what's happening through about the toddlerhood phase. And as we talked about before, there's very specific neurological development, more neurons, more connections between neurons. And notice, we've mostly covered all the neuroscience stuff that we need to, and also physical stuff. So for this chapter 3, I want to focus mostly on cognitive change, cognitive development, and also socio-emotional, affective development over these first 2 years. Because again, many things that we talk about for these first 2 or 3 years of life, we refer to in different terms for the rest of our lifespan. And I think that's very interesting for us to dive into some of those examples. First of all, let's revisit some of our perspectives. So for example, we have the classic behaviorist perspective, and again, the behaviorists were especially B.F. Skinner, but also Pavlov and his dogs. And again, behaviorist thinking is a very powerful kind of learning, and in many ways, a kind of learning that we never forget. Once we learn that something goes with another thing, our basic reaction is to expect in the future, if we see one of those things or smell one of those things or experience one of those things that scared us before, that it's going to happen again. And a lot of this happens not through our higher order thinking, high level conceptual understanding of our environment. It's just basic over time through experience. So Piaget referred to this as circular reactions. We learn that our actions have consequences, just like a baby learning that pressing buttons or hitting or kicking these objects around them make those objects do things. They don't have a symbolic higher level conceptual understanding of what those things are, but they've learned that they can affect them. And that's an important stage in early development before you can get to the more complicated stuff. Also today we're going to introduce what's known as the psychometric perspective. So you're taking a metric or putting numbers to psychological things. And what that means is we identify something that we really want to measure, and for whatever purpose it could be, because we want to find out if our child's behind, we want to find if our child is a genius, we want to find out if our child has a certain personality trait or not. And this is the whole idea behind standardization. And there are definitely pros and cons that go with the standardized movement, but we're here. And the whole idea is we can measure things better if we have the right test and the right questions, and then a whole bunch of data behind it, a nice representative sample, and then we can put regarding something about intelligence or language development, we can have a new child, give them that assessment, and we can have a precise way to place them percentage-wise relative to other students that age, where they fit. So again, this can be used in a bad way. If somebody is below average on a standardized test, we have to know about that attribute to determine if even an intervention is necessary, or if that thing might just likely come back and it just started to develop abnormally, but is likely to come back normally. We also have the cognitive perspective. This is what we're going to focus on heavily today, especially in those first 2 years of life. How do you decide what things are? How do you use labels? How do you associate things with words? So now we're introducing language. How do you decide what things are like other things and what things are something entirely new that you've never seen, that you have really no background understanding to help you process this new thing? And of course we have the biological neuroscience. We'll talk just a little bit about that today, and of course dive deeper into that for future chunks of the lifespan. When we start with cognitive development with children, the name to start with first is good old Jean Piaget. And basically, he was the one who came up with the age-graded, stepwise chunking of the different age ranges and important boundaries for child development. So, of course, cognition involves mental activities involving thinking, memory, also language, basic problem solving. These are sort of the higher order, how do we think about and organize our world? So Piaget was big on what he referred to as symbols, kind of memories. We can also think about symbols as related to schemas. So many symbols can organize into one specific schema, which again is a concept or a framework that helps to organize or interpret information. It's essentially a lens through which we interpret a certain thing that we're exposed to. So for example, young children wouldn't have any memories of being born, so they wouldn't have any negative associations with a hospital. So for a child then to go to a hospital and be scared, well, that's evidence that they have a schema that sometimes scary things happen at hospitals. And of course, where did that schema come from? Most likely because they had been to a hospital before, had to, for example, sit on a cold table or get a shot or something along those lines. But we can also think about schemas in terms of gestures, such as blowing a kiss. Is this just a meaningless wave of a hand or the stinky symbol, or does the child have a schema, a basic understanding of, in some ways, the concept or even language that accompanies these symbols? Or, for example, another schema would be toys. So, for example, does this child know that pointing a gun at people is a way to threaten them or to get them to do something? Or is the schema not quite that developed, and the schema is just, hey, this is what this thing looks like, and I've seen other people with things like that. Here's what they do with them. And I would probably guess that that's the more likely explanation for this particular kid. We can also look at something like this, basic categorization. You or I would probably be able to understand that this is a chair, but this is so different in terms of the features that we see that many kids might not put this into their schema of a chair. So there's lots of examples. Schemas are continually developing throughout our entire lifetimes. And so we're talking about a very important basic process that really can be added on and subdivide schemas over and over again the more we learn about pretty much any aspect of the world that we want to try and organize. So one idea is basic categorization. So early on, you have to learn if something is dangerous, if something is fun, if something is helpful or will provide nourishment or something you need. So we have this difference between conceptual versus perceptual categorization. And why do I have the dog example? Well, think about a perceptual. Basically, perceptual, you're just looking at, for example, these dogs and trying to describe them, right? Well, one has black and white fur, one has a more narrow nose and has brown, light brown, and dark brown fur. Now, the conceptual means you already know something about these dogs. So you might be thinking, oh, well, they're both collies. And you have further subdivided that concept into collies, that this is a border collie versus this is a standard collie. And, border collies and standard collies were trained to behave a little bit differently. So border collies might need a little bit more work to do, may be not quite as affectionate, but you only know that if you've had experience with these specific kinds of dogs before. So again, perceptual is more about what does it look like, versus conceptual is more about what do you know about it. Another example would be asking kids to draw something. And do they draw, for example, the major features, or do they draw that thing doing something? So if you just ask them to draw a hammer, do they just draw what a hammer looks like, or do they draw it with action lines, or maybe somebody's hands wrapped around it? And that's evidence that they conceptually can see what a hammer is supposed to be used for. Another example would be, think about sports. If you haven't gone to many basketball or football games and someone asks you to describe what's happening, you'd probably say, well, there's some loud noises, there's a lot of people running around, sometimes they jump, sometimes they try to run into each other, sometimes they try to avoid each other, right? And that's very perceptual. You're describing what you see. Whereas the conceptual, if you've watched a lot of either football or basketball or any other sport, you'll be able to determine patterns. You'll be able to know why this guy's moving relative to the other person, and why sometimes they avoid each other, what the play probably is, because you've seen that specific play before. So there's tons of examples that we could apply to this basic idea of moving from perceptual to conceptual processing and organizing your world. For the next few stages of childhood, we're going to see what Piaget has to say. So basically, up till adolescence, Piaget has a certain stage that you fall into based on your age. And according to him, in your first 2 years, you're in the sensorimotor stage. That is a appropriately named title because basically you're mostly focused on learning how to move around in your environment and learning how to process what you see or what you sense. It's less about the top-down, very refined schemas. It's more about what is this new thing and what can I do with it. So obviously you see some of our basic reflexes have to deal with sensorimotor things like grasping. And of course, children, babies are less visually dominant than adults. And so instead of just looking at something to understand it, they're much more likely to try and pick it up and squish it and put it in their mouths. Then they also learn these circular reactions that we talked about before. Actions have consequences. And this is not specifically about getting in trouble, but it's, for example, learning that, let's say you've got a toy, and the toy has a squeaker in it, sort of like a dog learning how to play with a toy. They have heard that squeaker go, and they assume that all they have to do is touch it. But as they continue to play and learn about the object, they'll learn that you don't just touch it, you have to touch it in the right place and in the right way. And so that's at a very basic level how sensorimotor learning can play out. So then you get to this attempt to, once you've learned kind of how it works, then you attempt to repeat the actions. And now you're saying, here's something I understand how it works and I want to do it again, and I want to be the one who makes it happen. And according to Piaget and also Erikson, this is a very good sign. It's a basic evolution of the sense of self. I know what I want, and I'm learning how I can get it. And then finally, once we get to the end of the sensorimotor stage, we're moving into a more language and symbol-driven version. So they might not be talking in complete sentences, and they probably certainly aren't, but they're clearly using gestures, and they're using basic words to show that they can communicate not only what they think and want about their environment, but also what they understand about the environment in a way that's light years more high level than early on in this stage. As with most of Piaget's stages, there are some criticisms. He didn't get much wrong, but you can nitpick a little bit. So he would say you have to go through these substages in this general order, which may not be true. There's not strong evidence to suggest that you can't get intentionality before learning that things have consequences. So that it makes sense. And then the order, especially the timing of the substages, I don't think there's strong evidence to say that these strongly line up to any specific month ages. And what we'll also see, and that we talked about with the chapter 2, is that to research babies, especially the pre-language or pre-linguistic stage and the sensorimotor stage, you can't ask them questions. You don't know what they know unless you have creative kind of research that can test things in a way that your average parent probably can't do. And the encouraging thing that we see repeated often in terms of findings is that the more creative research designs shows evidence for earlier understanding than was previously believed to exist. So of course, one thing that kids learn very quickly is how to get attention. And we learn that what starts as a social smile, or what starts as a tantrum because you're actually hungry or need a diaper change, sometimes they associate doing those things just to get attention, which shows not only that they are evolving and becoming more complex in terms of their behavior and their expectations for the environmental response, but also showing that parents need to be there to either positively reinforce or punish that kind of behavior. So you don't throw a temper tantrum for the poopy diaper tantrum if you don't actually have one. We also see some other features of Piaget's sensorimotor stage. We see the example of imitation, which is something for any parent or caretaker to keep in mind. So what's first of all most apparent is the classic elicited, right? So for example, you try to color or put together a puzzle and then see if the 1-year-old can also put together that chunky puzzle or make an object move in a certain way. If they show elicited imitation, they can imitate that on the spot. It's showing that they understood what happened, and then they can understand also how they can do it themselves. Now, the funny thing is, what happens when you try to elicit a response and show someone, and again, it's usually going to be a 1 to 1.5-year-old, to do something and they can't do it. What are you then to conclude? Does that mean they didn't understand that thing? They have no schema, they have no concept of what happened? Well, sometimes that may be the case, but other times we see this interesting deferred imitation, which is they see something and they can't elicit or imitate the response then, but then they'll do it later at a seemingly random time. So for example, some classic examples would be a child in preschool sees one child throw a temper tantrum because one of their toys was stolen. And so maybe in that moment or the next time the child who watched that happen doesn't throw a temper tantrum when they don't get something they want, but maybe a week later or a month later, somebody takes something from them and then they throw the tantrum because they've seen this other child do it. Or even a more classic example would be, let's say, kids are often interested in what their parents are doing in the kitchen. And so, for example, if they learn that they like pizza, they may want to try and help make pizza. And let's say maybe that specific action would be spreading the cheese on the pizza. And so deferred, they watch me spread the cheese on the pizza, and then I show them, okay, now you try to spread it around, and they don't really do it. They can't get it anywhere close to even. It's a mess. And I think, did they learn anything when I showed them? And then deferred would be, without practicing, let's try it again a month later, and then they can do it. Which just goes to show that a lot of development cognitively happens not in the moment when they see that thing done. And I think it's important for parents and educators to understand that. So this is classic zone of proximal development stuff, meaning just because you couldn't do it in that moment doesn't mean you didn't know anything about it. Now, some of the more classic examples we see that I'm sure we're all familiar with is this idea of object permanence. So basically, before 8 to 12 months, you can do peekaboo, and it's thrilling for a 6-month-old because to them, if they can't see your face, it's as if your face has magically disappeared. What's nice, though, is, of course, peekaboo might still be fun after a year of age, but it's not because they, like before, believed that your face no longer exists. Instead, it works as a great opportunity for social interaction and emotional development. Now, we also have representational ability. This is the idea that you have some sort of concept of what a fireman does or what a policeman does, and you can pretend and imagine. And it's not just trial and error learning, because you are actually playing that role, maybe just having not seen much of it before, at least play acted that before. You've watched it on a video, you've seen other people do it, and then you can actually pretend to be that thing without having practiced much. Now, both these object permanence and representational seem to be very simple, and at the very basic level they are, but Piaget, and not for our purposes, but Piaget would even break down something like object permanence into like a 5 or 6 step sequence. So first of all, how if the face is gone or the toy is gone, does the child reach out to try and find it? Because that shows at least some development of coming closer to a full understanding of object permanence. So we appreciate all the work that Piaget did, and it seems some of these seem simple and obvious, but he's done a lot beyond just what we're covering here. One of the best examples of elicited imitation happens at a very early age. You can take babies that are only a couple months old and then do the basic blowing raspberry versus blowing air out of your mouth smoothly versus opening your mouth wide. And babies, even with their limited vision in those early months, can still do basic imitation. Again, showing that they are aware of their environments in ways that potentially we didn't fully appreciate before. But of course, fast forward to a toddler, so someone in the early twos, and things like dinner can be very frustrating because you might think that you're meeting meaningfully on the same agreement, but we see this sense of self and autonomy that has kicked in. And this is, again, a source of potential fights, but it's also a sign of positive development about an understanding of who you are and wanting to express that and influence your environment. So I don't think parents should take this kind of thing personally. It's just a teaching moment, and you can choose what to reinforce and what to not reinforce. We're going to step in here quickly for the psychometric perspective. We've already talked about one of these in chapter 2, but basically we're talking about massive dimensions or buckets of development. And so first of all, we have motor development. And as we talked about before, the Denver Developmental Screening Test is the best example. Again, it's mostly for these first few years, 3 or 4, and primary gains are in gross motor development, but there's others as well. And again, as we talked about last time, it also includes some norms for milestones of social development and language development. And again, what makes a standardized test worth the money that it costs to take it? Basically, it's not just the magic questions, although the questions and the tasks that they have you do are important. It's also about what kind of reference sample do they have. And all these have big standardized normative samples that reflect and represent pretty much any kid from the larger population that it's meant to represent. So that means for all of these, they've got tests of or databases and years of data that you can aggregate to have more precise boundaries for what's the top 5%, what's the middle 50%, and so on. Also, we have, for in this term, cognitive development, the Bailey scales of development. And the Bailey scales are, as you can see, involve a lot of activities, following instructions, sequences of patterns and instructions. And this is an idea of if you think your 2-year-old, is a genius, that should reflect on some of the dimensions of the Bailey scales. Finally, we have to also, and this is something we often forget, is whether a child is looking normal or not can be a product of maybe things internal or genetic to some extent, but it's also going to be a major product of what does the environment look like, especially the home environment. And so if we want to know if an environment is sufficiently stimulating and healthy and nurturing, homes is one of the biggest tests for that. Now, ideally, all these are used to find maybe best practices and help everybody improve, but in reality, the home's measure or assessment is often used for cases where there's a strong suspicion or evidence that there's being neglect or unsanitary conditions. And so basically at the baseline, this is used, for example, for family services and social work to see if critical periods might be being missed. Essential stuff that, if not being provided, can represent neglect. And again, with Erickson, parents and caretakers need to do basic stuff to take care of their kids, make sure they're healthy, make sure they're talked to, make sure they have toys, to form this basic trust and attachment that we've already talked about and will continue to talk about, so that they can later, the children, develop autonomy and initiative in the later years. Here's an example of what the Bailey scales would include. And as you can see, it is a for-profit company. And so these things don't come cheap, and you have to pay for somebody who's been trained to deliver these assessments. And I think for children it might be kind of fun to be able to interact with some of these objects and do some of these tasks. And of course, like a classic standardized test, you're going to get some overall scores and percentiles, and then a bunch of subdivisions in terms of breaking down various dimensions of cognitive development. And you can see it's age graded, of course. You wouldn't ask a 2-year-old to be able to solve the same problems that a 1-year-old might be asked. And you can see there's a lot of motor sequences involved as well. Here we see an example of research using the Holmes measure, again testing the quality of the early child environment. And we can see for children who are raised, or for children who have IQs equal to or above 90, that's higher or a little bit below average versus clearly below average. And we see, does high IQ or normal IQ correlate with any sort of better home environment? And clearly we see on the overall score, yeah, 5-point difference. And those specific dimensions that we see differences are better learning stimulation environment for high IQ kids, and also a higher warmth and affection, and also a higher variety and experience. But notice it's also not universal. So for example, not a difference in the physical environment in terms of intelligence, although it's important to measure the physical environment for other things to make sure that children are getting adequate nutrition. We can also look at, again, this isn't necessarily using the Holmes measure, but one dimension of potentially a neglectful environment would be if there's cocaine or somebody doing cocaine actively in the house. And we see that there is a difference in those not exposed to a cocaine environment, that they have better overall cognitive ability scores, and including most of the subdimensions too. So let's talk about some non-Piaget cognitive milestones. First of all, we see improvement in attention. If you think about your average 1-year-old, they're in most cases controlled in terms of attention by the environment. If something is loud, if something is giving off a lot of light, if something is moving, they're going to look at that. And so even if they're supposed to be focusing or paying attention on something important like eating, they're going to focus on that big thing making the noise because they can't control their attention. We also see the idea of joint attention. So for example, if you're both working on Play-Doh, are you looking over to the person beside you to see what they're doing, or are you only focused on what you're doing? And we should see by 1 year that even if you're focused on a task, you'll also be looking at what people around you are doing. And you can measure this through eye movement studies. I'll have an example coming up here. But if you have 2 toys that are having a conversation, are you just focused on the one that's moving, or are you looking back and forth between them? And by 1 year, you should probably be looking back and forth because you realize that a conversation has to have 2 people to be meaningful. Also, if we look at memory, what's happening? Well, as we talked about before, a lot of our learning, especially in the first year, is non-language based. So it's more of the behaviorist, classical, and especially operant conditioning. And we see tons of gains in implicit memory. You learn what expectations to have of certain people. Is somebody going to be loud? Is someone going to play with you? Is a certain TV show going to have stuff that interests you or not? So there's all sorts of these basic implicit or unconscious associations that happen, especially primarily in the first year. Then we start to fold in, especially with language and learning words in the second year, explicit formation. So remembering what you did yesterday, or remembering what a certain, for example, imaginary friend likes to eat. The problem is, though, the hippocampus is not fully formed in the first 2 years of life. So maybe you can remember something that happened yesterday, but you're very unlikely to remember something that happened 6 months ago, partly because the brain wiring for those things is that kind of memory is just not set up yet. We can also talk about the working or short-term memory. So again, this is trying to have somebody tell you their phone number and try to repeat it in your head for as long as you can. And again, if there's no distractions, maybe we can keep that full phone number in our head for a good 30 seconds. But as kids don't have, 2-year-olds don't have that large of a working memory or last that long. And I think that's what we observe from watching them behave. They just can't focus on one thing or remember what they were trying to do before getting distracted by something else. Now, there is a brain structure, and we call it the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC, that develops in accordance with development of more adult capacity and efficiency working memory. But for the 2-year-olds, it's got a long ways to go. So here's an example of sort of joint attention test. Let's say this baby's 6 months old, and make sure he or she is watching the model, and then watches the model as she is talking and turns her head toward a toy. Now, joint attention is not there if the child doesn't also look at this toy. And I see this child turning too, so is that evidence of joint attention? Well, you'd have to see it displayed over multiple trials to be sure, but that's how it would look like. If we also want to look at a basic test of the sense of self, here is one of the classics. So you take a child and they have a basic concept or schema of what they should look like, or what a child should look like, or what a face should look like, especially. And then you do something different to that face. You can put a red dot on the forehead. You could stick a piece of cereal to their cheek, right? And then they look at that and they have the basic understanding that a face, something is wrong with the face. And the next question is, do they realize that it's their face? Well, until just after a year, they don't. They don't have a sense of what they look like, which is kind of hard to even wrap our heads around as adults. So until just after a year, do this basic paradigm, child will realize that their schema for what a face should look like has been violated in some way, and then they reach to touch the mirror. They try to touch the spot on the mirror because they don't realize that it's them. And then between 15 months or so to a year and a half, keep doing it, and then they should very quickly, you'll see the shift when they realize it's them, and instead of trying to touch the mirror, they try to touch their own face. And it seems like a small thing, but it's actually a big step to realize that you are your own person and that you have a certain look that's distinct from the people around you. Let's also look at language development. First, we have what is known as the pre-linguistic stage, and this lasts for about the first 10 months. And so, as you can see, I've got the feral children, or children who were neglected and basically stuck in the attic or a basement. Of course, we look at that as criminal neglect because children who, the good thing is language isn't in the first year critical period. You can still learn language for the most part, but there is this critical period of the sounds. And so, if you are not exposed to basic language, there might be some sounds that later on if you weren't exposed to them in the first year of life, you can do expensive speech language pathology but still not be able to get some of those basic sounds, even though you understand what the words mean. If you look at some of the basic milestones, the first word appears at about a year. We see babbling starts to happen about 6 months, and imitation of words and sounds will happen about 10 months. We also see, once we get to those first few words, children aren't talking in sentences for the most part. Instead, they use what we know now as a holophrase. So they'll use one single word and expect others to understand that they're not just referring to that, and they might change their intonation or combine that with a gesture to say that, for example, they want food, and they'll say food, and then they point to the cookie. And so you don't know what food they want, but they're using food specifically for one particular kind of food, but don't have the language to communicate that. Now once we go to 1.5 to 2 years, again, we're not talking in full sentences, but we, instead of single words, now we're talking about phrases, which are usually just 1 or 2 or 3 words. So for example, you can still combine them with gestures. So language is not just spoken language for sure. And this is my example. I had some friends with younger kids, and they would try to introduce their 2-year-old to me and me to the 2-year-old, and they could never remember my specific name. They don't have that explicit memory level yet, or that detailed level of schema, but they did have general schemas for whether this was a friend of mommy or a friend of daddy. And telegraphic speech can also involve things like down now, saying maybe they want to go down on the floor from the chair or out of the crib. I remember after supper, our 2-year-old would always say, down Jack Herbie, because he wanted to go down on the floor with our dogs, and that was him telling us that he was done at the dinner table. So it involves a lot of meeting in the middle for parents to understand what their kids are trying to say. But if you just listen to the words, you're not getting nearly the full meaning that they're trying to express. What also we see with regard to language is this idea of transitioning from the universal linguist. So again, that first year, and especially when they start babbling to when they start imitating, that's not a passive process. They are trying to map out things that they are hearing in their environment. And if they are hearing in their environment multiple languages, they will say those sounds and those phrases as best they can, and most importantly, their brain will also be mapping them. And if that doesn't happen for a second or third language, or even the basic sounds of the primary language, those synaptic connections that were there and could have represented those sounds go away. And so this is a transition from being able to distinguish all the different sounds of all the different languages that we know, and then usually then converted to a more efficient speaker of just one or two or maybe more than one language. And of course, oftentimes we hear what kids are trying to say, but don't understand what they're trying to say. And how do you know the difference between babbling and wordplay versus intentional use of a word? I know one of my classic examples was my 1.5-year-old came up to me and kept saying, Aikiko, Aikiko. And I thought, oh, okay. Did you name somebody Aikiko? No, he had a little toy ice cream cone in his hand, and he was trying to say ice cream cone, but he just couldn't do it. But that was him trying to communicate to me what he had. And so if parents and caretakers are really looking, they can find tons of these examples. Now, of course, language development oftentimes doesn't proceed into, for example, winning the Nobel Prize in poetry. So basically, some people's language doesn't really evolve past basic phrases. So some people don't really talk in complete sentences, and that's because they probably weren't raised in a linguistically rich environment. And of all the things we know, that what parents and caretakers do has a strong effect on whether the child is advanced or behind. It is in terms of language development. What parents do, especially at early ages, has a huge impact on language development, an impact of the magnitude that you'll never see for something like mathematics or spatial development. And I think a lot of the structure that Piaget came up with and put down has lasted and aged pretty well. But now if we think about the way that even young kids are communicating, so at what time do kids start texting, and what kind of words and phrases do they use in the non-spoken language environment? And so that's one thing to think about, is that pretty much all children throughout history, if they have the basic environment, will learn a spoken language. Although written language is a whole different story. Many cultures throughout history have not really had much written language. So learning to speak a language is a human universal. Learning to write one, we don't believe there's evidence for that. So what are some strategies to teach language most effectively? A lot of these things many parents will naturally do, but here's some tips that are supported by research. First of all, there's this idea of child-directed speech. And so this is a specific kind of speech that's devoted to younger children. And it's important that this is not motherese or baby talk. It's not gibberish, right? It is specific patterns such as expanding on, because let's say your child is using hollow phrases and telegraphic speech. They are trying to communicate more, but if you expand on that and fill in the blanks and complete the sentence for them, they're going to start doing that sooner. Also, it's a good idea to be rephrasing, basically repeating but using synonyms or different words or phrases that can mean the same thing. That can have a big impact on later language complexity. And then also orienting attention. So for example, if you're reading a book with a bear in it, keep talking about the bear. What is the bear thinking? What is the bear doing? Why is the bear trying to do this? It's making all those connections for interpreting a situation in a more complex way that the children at that age isn't naturally going to do, but you can do these things for child-directed speech, which represent a scaffold for more advanced language and more efficient language development. Also, you want to use facial emotions and gestures because, as we've talked about, spoken language is just only part of the way that a toddler communicates, and they are communicating with gestures and facial emotions too. And so since they're using that language, this is your way of meeting with them and to put words to the gestures and the facial expressions that they're using. And of course, it's important to interact. It's not just Skinnerian reinforcement in that they want to talk with you because they want your attention. They are trying to learn higher order understanding of what things go with what. How do I match up these different modalities of communication? And so again, like child-directed speech, using guided participation, don't just passively read them the story. Pause, make faces, do gestures, ask questions, and all those things will help to improve and speed up the process of bringing in more information in terms of schema development and what words and phrases are relevant for a specific stimulus. And of course, this is what looks like healthy parenting styles. You are making eye contact and you're getting close, especially the younger your baby, because their visual acuity is less. So you have to get closer for them to actually see your facial expressions. Let's talk a little bit about emotion and personality development. First of all, it's important to distinguish between different kinds of emotions. So first of all, we have what are known as primal or primary emotions, and basically these are the ones that young babies will show. You don't need really much nurture or environment or teaching. It's kind of programmed into babies to express and understand at a basic level all these emotions. We'll talk about some of the secondary emotions in a bit, but these are the basics that don't have to be taught and aren't referenced relative to anything that a baby's done. It's not about shame or guilt or something like that. We also see the idea of display rules. So basically, when is it appropriate to yell and when is it not appropriate? And so at very early ages, especially toddlers, need to learn that it's okay to yell outside, but it's not okay to yell in church or yell in school. And I guess there's different display rules, of course, different genders. Kids are already learning at very young ages what their gender is, if they're a boy or a girl, and what kind of expectations and activities and behaviors go along with that. And again, we talked about David Buss before, looking for innate or genetic or evolved gender differences, and there's some there, but also many are learned, and parents should be careful and planful about which displays of gender do they want to reinforce or do not want to reinforce, because that has a strong impact on whether those behaviors along gender stereotypes, if you will be exhibited in the future. We also have this idea of, similar to display rules, emotional regulation. You have your primary emotions. Is that what's going to drive your behavior in most circumstances? Or can you regulate those primary emotions with secondary emotions? Can you step back and think, what kind of person I am? What kind of person do I want to be? And how do I behave in a way that's in line with that? And that's much more complicated than these basic primal or primary emotions. And it takes time, and it takes environmental support and correction to be able to develop. Of course, we can see some examples of primary emotions in our pets. And in some ways, this is evidence that if we think a dog experiences a primary emotion in a similar way to a 3-month-old baby, then there probably is some genetic and evolutionary background to these emotions. And of course, it's one thing to say that young babies experience complex emotions such as, I would say this would be interest, happy, angry, but it's also important to show how they experience it. And clearly they are using facial expressions that even adults recognize that go along with basic emotions. Again, there's probably a fair amount of evolutionary genetic programming in there regarding these emotions. Now we can see the basic ages at which they appear, and all these primary emotions are in the first year, clearly. Now, what are some secondary emotions that maybe aren't genetically programmed and are much more a consequence of what makes you feel prideful, what makes you feel guilty, what makes you feel contemptful of another human being? You have to learn those, and that's a product of what parents are doing, what peers or other kids they're seeing are showing in terms of display rules for, should I feel guilty for calling someone a name, or should I feel prideful for that? And children are very much susceptible to learning those associations based on the people and the environments that they're in. And parents and educators and caretakers need to be very careful of those things. Notice we haven't talked about baby personality yet, because babies may have characteristic or average ways of behaving and reacting to situations, but we don't call it personality because it's not necessarily predictive of how they're going to be in terms of personality later on. So instead of calling it personality, we call it temperament. Temperament is a general baby's pattern of acting to certain situations. And you can see some common dimensions. Are they adventurous? Are they very interactive with their environment? Do they display self-control? Can they, for example, keep themselves from eating the entire box of cookies if they're given the chance? And how extroverted are they? How much do they go up to other people and try to talk with them, try to learn from them? And you can see some of the basic categories that have been used in the past. You've got your easy baby, basically doesn't have a problem being put in different situations, not too much trouble to drop them off at the babysitter. There's difficult. These are the ones that can be kind of clingy. And then the slow to warm up. They don't show as much love or affection as the average. And again, it may be if you didn't get an easy baby, you're worried about what comes later. Just know that there's many cases of babies who were difficult that become very well-adjusted and nice adults, and there's easy babies that become difficult and challenging adults. It's just not very predictive at these early ages of where it will end up in adulthood. And you can also see there is some genetic component to temperament, but it's at best moderate. So unlike some of the other things we've talked about, temperament seems more receptive to the environment, and it can change into whatever the later personality is going to turn into. We also see some social development milestones. These are some I think we're very familiar with. So of course we have stranger anxiety, and again about 8 months or so, what used to be a baby that you could pass around at parties and family gatherings and would love to get attention from anybody, now they start to show stranger anxiety. And I think that's no surprise that it's also starting to correspond with the development of the sense of self, to say, oh, wait a minute, I start to recognize that people are different, and also that I don't have to do whatever they tell me to do. And so those things kind of combine to show stranger anxiety. So of course it's funny when people take their 1-year-old to Mall Santa and they don't get the dream shot that they were hoping to get. But it's very normal, and it should start going away in the next year or two. We also see separation anxiety. Can you, for example, leave your child with a family member that child knows fairly well? And if the response is a temper tantrum, is it just poor temperament, or is it possibly haven't practiced or reinforced or punished the tantrum behaviors in the past? I think it's important to understand is that some degree of separation anxiety is normal, and we know some of it might be temperament. There wasn't much a parent could have done, but some of it is definitely learned, and so some of that's a product of what parents have reinforced and punished or not reinforced and punished, with the understanding that chances are if it was learned the wrong way, it can also be unlearned and fixed. Also, we see separation anxiety being used to describe, I guess, dysfunction in adult relationships. That's a different thing from the separation anxiety that children experience. So let's see what Erickson has to say about this part of the lifespan. Basically, this is general attachment in the first year to year and a half. And the whole idea is if parents are interacting with their kids, they're picking them up, they're touching them, they're playing with them, they're feeding them, they're taking care of dirty diapers. It's a lot of work, but all that work basically guarantees the formation of basic trust, meaning that the child understands that the world is not this scary, dangerous place that I have to fight for everything and do everything myself. And again, they're not thinking that in those exact words, but the failure to form basic trust, or failure specifically for parents to provide an environment in which basic trust will form, will likely translate into the child thinking those kinds of things later on when they're an adolescent and early adult. So let's think about maybe some basic attachment styles, similar to what we talked about in the previous slide: difficult, easy, slow to warm up. these look pretty similar. Secure is easy. Avoidant means they, for example, don't want to be as close or give as much affection as the parents want. Resistant would be that they are very angry and frustrated when the parents have to leave. And you can just, for example, go to a park and in a non-creepy way watch some of these dynamics. And what you should see with secure attachment is that children will every minute or so look back to see if their mom or dad's there or caretaker, and then once they see that, then they go and play, and then maybe every 5 minutes come back and just check in, touch, grab their leg, and then go play happily. Whereas the avoidant will just keep playing and basically ignore the parent, and then the resistant will want to just be clingy and stick with the parent and will be resistant to do anything away from them. Now, we're also at sort of that borderline between the next stage. So once basic trust is formed, and again, without neglect, chances are it will, then we need to see autonomy. And think about what this means. We're at about 1.5 to 2 years old. We're seeing the terrible twos. And Erickson would view that as teachable moments where kids are going to start showing basic autonomy in ways that we would find as adults non-rational and sometimes, and maybe unethical, or in some ways maybe a little violent. But that's in some ways a good thing to see, and it's important that parents and caretakers are there to correct those behaviors when they are not expressed properly. Now, related to this idea of basic trust that Erickson was developing, we also had Harlow basically doing the same thing, or trying to understand the same thing, but just in a parallel way. So he was talking about attachment, and in this case, you take a newborn chimp, separate the chimp from its mother, which you can certainly argue is quite unethical, and we don't need to do any more of that. Some chimps are raised with this wire mother that does provide food, and others were raised with this terry cloth mother that did not provide food, but at least had some tactile comfort and a face that looked somewhat like a monkey. And then, even more unethically, they would take these chimps and scare them and see which mother they ran to. And so the chimps that were raised with a terry cloth mother would go to that terry cloth mother and then lean over to get food. If they were scared, they would always go to this mother, which makes a lot of sense. And then take these chimps and then put them in strange situations, a room that they'd never been in. Those raised with a terry cloth mother, you can argue that they were far from normally developed, but at least in that room with the terry cloth mother, they would gradually explore aspects of the room. Chimps that were raised just with this wire mother, put them in an unfamiliar situation, and they are unwilling to explore their environment. And of course, think about how similar humans are to chimps, and we don't want to see a similar thing ever with children, but we think the process works in a fairly similar way. So again, we got to be careful, and there has to be legal punishments for parents who do not provide an environment for basic attachment or basic trust to form. So as I already previewed, autonomy is sort of the terrible twos in some ways, trying to boss people around. Toddlers are bossy, but Erickson is showing that's the basic formation of autonomy. Once they start being bossy, then can they learn how to not be bossy? That's the question. And of course they can, and it's a result of what types of things parents and caretakers are doing. Now, beyond just punishing bad behavior and reinforcing good behavior, we also have the cognitive aspect known as internalization. So it's moving beyond just knowing what's right and wrong and good and bad, and knowing that you'll get punished if you do the bad thing. This is internalizing those values, those larger principles. And what's amazing is we've been talking about the formation of self. Who am I? What do I want to do? What do I represent? And internalizing means, well, those higher values are going to come from somewhere. They don't just naturally happen. And so with the right parental environment, and as we'll find out, authoritative parents are what provide this environment for internalization, instilling higher order morality into the self. And that will also translate into what we see as self-regulation. This is the idea that you can regulate your behavior, your thoughts, your interaction between your primal emotions and your higher order ones. So if a child is feeling very frustrated, do they just break out and cry and then they're done for the next half hour? Or can they self-regulate? They feel that frustration. Can they think positive thoughts to get out of that mindset? Can they down-regulate the frustration or down-regulate the fear and find a way to go upstairs and go in your room even when you might be scared of monsters, right? Can you lower your heart rate? Can you reduce that primary fear? And so that's what the idea of self-regulation is. Another example of, as adults might feel. What do you do when no one's watching? So for example, if you're learning from home or working from home, how is your diet, your dress different? And if you find out that you change a lot based on when you're out in public or in a certain environment compared to when you're at home, well, chances are you haven't internalized those things much. You're just dressing up or eating well to be reinforced in some way. It's not a basic part of what makes you feel good or bad. And so obviously there's tons of examples and this could get very complicated, but I think we get the basic ideas of how these emotional regulation and internalization of values can work. And as we wrap up, here is, I thought, a funny example. Imagine just normal life if 2-year-olds or toddlers were our bosses. And clearly, they have a long way to go in terms of what's real and in terms of what's their priority. As adults, we have things that we have to do and we have to focus on getting them done. Toddlers don't have that internal dialogue for the most part. They want to have fun. They want to take something that's intended to do one thing and try to do something else with it. And again, this is all very normal. And Erickson would say this is problematic if left unchecked, but good parenting and school and caretaking environments will be essential to embrace the good aspects of this, but also tamp down and punish those that we don't want to see again. So hopefully you got some good examples and stuff to talk about, and we will finish this exam chunk. And next time we'll pick up with early childhood. Thanks for hanging in there. Take care.